Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pinkham, where it's been a busy place for the last couple of weeks. Liam Manning is on the verge of becoming Norwich City's new head coach. And to that end, I'm delighted to be joined by Dan Carter from Bristol Live, who covers Bristol City. So he's been probably even more busy than we have been over the last few days. First of all, Dan, thanks very much for coming on. Really appreciate it. I mean, how are you doing in what I can imagine is, as I said, quite a busy period?
Yeah, it's certainly been not the quiet end to the season we were hoping for. I think I've been telling everyone for the last 2 months, once the playoffs are out of the way, I might actually be able to leave the house a bit, but that's obviously all been blown out of the water straight away. So yeah, been a bit chaotic.
What did you make of it when you first sort of saw reports that Norwich might be interested in bringing Liam Manning in as their head coach? Were you surprised at all? And then when things sort of started to materialise and it looked like it would probably happen, were you even more surprised, or does it make sense?
I think there's almost been an acceptance that there would have been interest given the job he's done this season at Bristol City. I think he's probably been open about being a bit frustrated with a few decisions made at the club in the run-up to the playoffs. I think I'd be lying if I thought it would lead to something this quickly. I think, you expect to see so many names linked with these sort of jobs, and it felt like he was one of so many to start with that it was a bit of a surprise when it suddenly came out that he was up there, and it feels like, especially the last week or so, it has moved really quickly along, going from being one of a few to by far and away the front runner by the sound of it.
Have you been surprised at all that he's been maybe taken away by another Championship club? I know you mentioned that there probably would be interest. People might have been looking at sort of the teams at the bottom end of the top flight, or maybe some of those who came down. You know, you've got Leicester and Southampton, who both obviously there's speculation around Ruud van Nistelrooy's future, so it looked like both of those might have been looking for new managers. Are you surprised that actually it looks like he's going to somewhere or a team that finished actually quite a lot lower than Bristol City did in that Championship table in the end?
I think it's an odd one, isn't it? Because obviously there's the personal ties with Norwich as well. You know, he's obviously from the area. I think it's odd because it kind of, on paper, it does seem like a strange decision, but I think most Bristol City fans would accept it's a massive club. It probably, when you look at recent history and further back, it is probably a step forward. And when you look at the decisions he's made in his career, he hasn't been afraid to make those sort of difficult steps. You know, that's how he ended up at Bristol City in the first place, when he had a really good thing going at Oxford. I think it's probably a bit of a surprise, but then I do think in the same breath, everyone's saying Bristol City probably overachieved last year. So, you know, it's only really this season you've been able to say Bristol City have been a greater success than Norwich. I mean, Norwich were in the playoffs just last season, weren't they? So it's not, it's not like they've been mid-table like City have for nearly a decade now. It's still a massive club with recent history of success in this division.
Yeah, true. And you mentioned earlier the sort of the financial factor, the fact that Manning has sort of mentioned maybe that he would have liked a little bit more to spend at Bristol City. I think Norwich are a club now, which is a strange position to be in, given what it was like before for decades, really. But now they're in a position where, for a Championship club, they can actually spend quite a lot. So do you think that's had quite a significant impact on Manning's decision as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think it'd be wrong to say he hasn't been backed in his time at City. You know, they spent a lot of money last summer, probably not well enough. If you look back at the business they did, there was definitely some frustration around January. You know, I think they were in and around the top six at that time and didn't buy anyone and let Rob Atkinson, Fally Maulu and Cal Naismith all leave on loan. He's gone on the record with us and said that those are decisions that have frustrated him, or that window in general frustrated him. Steve Lansdowne's done interviews during the playoff campaign at Bristol City where he said they're not going to completely throw out their transfer strategy. They're probably going to go about things the same way. So there isn't going to be a war chest to spend at Ashton Gate. He probably feels, from my point of view anyway, there's the basis of a good squad now. You probably need those high-profile additions to kick on and actually get promotion to the Premier League.
Yeah.
And those are obviously the ones that take more money, and if that's not on offer, you can understand the attraction of a club where that is going to be on offer, especially with some of the assets available for sale. You know, it does make so much sense.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of internally at the club, obviously you'll have been speaking to various people to sort of find out what's been going on. Do you get the sense that they've been surprised at all by these developments, or disappointed, or do you think they almost saw it coming as well?
It's hard to say, like I think it's probably happened quicker than anyone would have expected. I think they've known about the interest. It's obviously been around for a while, the link, but it's probably too hard for me to say. I don't think they would have been expecting to be heading into the summer without him in charge.
Yeah.
We sat down and did an interview with him the day after the second leg of the playoff semi-final. We were down at the training ground with him. The BBC did the same, and there was talk about next season. I think he did the same in the club interview. So I think it'd be wrong to suggest they were expecting it, but I also probably think it's impossible to ignore that when your manager's done a good job, he's going to be linked with other jobs.
Yeah, of course. And to sort of come on to that job that he's done and what you've made of what he's done at Bristol City overall, obviously from afar, I think most neutral fans were pretty impressed by what he did at Bristol City. As you mentioned, a long history of being sort of mid-table in the Championship and getting them into the playoffs at the end there. And it wasn't necessarily, although the season didn't end particularly well, they were, in and around those places for quite a long time. So how good a job do you feel, having watched it from close quarters, Manning did, especially last season, but even going back before that at Bristol City?
I think it's important to keep in mind the situation he kind of came into as well. It was a fan base that really took to Nigel Pearson and were incredibly frustrated by the decision to sack him. I think it didn't matter who they appointed, they were probably going to have to come in and try to win over the fans. And I think Liam certainly had that. But I think focusing on the season just gone, I think it'd be harsh, or it'd be wrong for anyone to suggest that squad's a top 6 squad. Definitely, there's some really good players in there. You like Jason Knight, Anis Mehmeti had a really good season, but probably from 1 to 11, they're not quite top 6 ready. And especially, I think the second half of the season, he found this way of playing that, despite having injuries, not much depth really to work with at all, they just kept finding a way to win games. And I do think so much of what made him successful last season was the mentality of the group. In our sort of roles, you get the privilege of speaking to players, and every single one of them was talking about level-headedness and them never getting ahead of themselves. And I think a lot of that probably comes down to his own personal circumstances, where, I think the value of football's probably changed in his life over the last year. But I think there's always a tendency, isn't there, when a manager leaves to kind of go, well, they weren't that good, or the same with a player. But it's the first playoff campaign this club's had in 17 years. And if there's a sort of an agreement that the recruitment might not have been good enough, and that probably only makes the job that he did even better.
Yeah, it is interesting actually that you mentioned that, because I have seen, and I was going to ask you about it, really, a lot of Bristol City fans sort of talking particularly about the style of play. And as you mentioned, I think it's only natural for fans of clubs to maybe talk about coaches and players not being quite as good as maybe some people think they are when they do leave. But one thing that I do keep seeing crop up is sort of talk about maybe the football being a little bit boring, and a lot of Bristol City fans wanting it to be a bit more exciting. Do you think that's fair, or does that fall into the category of maybe slightly harsh criticism when it looks like somebody's going to leave?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think the Liam Manning fans saw in the first season, that style of football is probably completely different to what we've seen for the last 12 months. He's on the record over and over said that basically he found the team really hard to watch last season in possession. When he came in, it was so much about showing things up at the back. They've been leaking goals, and that led to probably there wasn't enough quality going forward. This season, I think it's kind of like any team, they're inconsistent. When they're playing great football, some of the goals they've scored under him, I think, I'd suggest any Norwich fans who are looking for highlight reels of what to expect. There's a goal against Preston away at the start of last season where it's a flowing move where players are running off the shoulder, one-touch passing. There was a goal against Millwall early on where, it's really good to watch. Equally, there's been games where they played Hull, I think it was March, it stands out. Hull went down to 10 men about 7 minutes in, and it was about 80 minutes of just crosses into the box with no one to hit. And he's admitted that he knows he's kind of held his hands up at times and gone, they're not doing enough or not showing enough quality in the final third. I think he tries to play football the right way. And obviously I don't watch loads of Norwich, but from what we saw of even Johannes Hoff Thorup's team, is trying to get the ball down, trying to play. And that's what he wants to do. What's been nice to see this season is he's not been afraid to mix that up. Probably the change of fortune came when they were a bit more direct, a bit more willing to hit the channel, get Sinclair Armstrong into the game. He's probably more adaptable than people give him credit for. Not necessarily in games, but he's got a set of principles, but he will work on them and adjust them to find a way to win.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about the fact that after Nigel Pearson went, that Bristol City almost needed somebody to sort of galvanise the fans a little bit and bring them back on side. You said he was good at that. So is that another strength of his? I think when Thorup was in charge for all of the things that obviously eventually got him sacked by Norwich, his communication was very, very good. So is that something that Norwich fans can expect to continue from Manning? What's his style like in sort of the press and communicating with fans?
I think he'd probably admit it himself. He's not going to come out and write your headline for you, or like he's probably not a big quote-based manager. You're not going to get the buzzwords, but I think it's a really interesting situation to look at, because I do think probably the factors at Bristol City kind of changed things a bit. You know, I think it'd probably be safe to say there was still a set of fans kind of undecided on him at the start of last season. Obviously, he lost his young son, and he came back, and the players and the fans, it did seem to kind of just group them together a little bit, pull everyone a bit closer together. What I think is one of his attributes for me is that you can tell he cares. He's not a Nigel Pearson that he's going to stand there and berate players or, you know, to the extremes, but he is, after wins, he tends to walk over to the little corner of Ashton Gate and like 3 fist bumps to the fans, and like he's quite laid back. I get the impression he's a coach first who doesn't necessarily like the manager side as much of it, but equally he says the right things, but he's also quite devoted to his principles, that he's not going to be over the top at any point, I don't think.
Yeah, and just finally, I wanted to ask you about sort of youth development and bringing young players through, because I think that's something that Norwich are pretty famous for now at this stage. It's definitely something that they want from their next head coach. And you'd think from his background, obviously he came through academies at Ipswich and West Ham, and then he was at New York in a couple of different roles with the academy. You'd think that he would be able to bring through young players, but again, that does fall into that category where I've maybe seen a few fans saying that isn't his forte. So what would you say, Dan, on that? Do you think he does have those capabilities of improving and bringing through young players?
I think it's an interesting one from a like City sort of lens, because there's young, I think he's an England youth international, Elijah Morrison's been in and around the Bristol City first team all season. He's a left wing back. City have been playing with wing backs, and he's going to end the season with 4 sub appearances, and he's not going to start at a game. I think that's kind of the player Bristol City fans focus on when they point to the lack of youth development. Equally, although it's not his development, there's Max O'Leary, Cam Pring, Zach Viner. There's quite a few academy graduates in that squad. It seems to be something people have suggested throughout his career. It didn't happen as much at MK or Oxford as well. I think the caveat to that would be, for me, of you've got to have the youth players ready to progress. I think until a new manager comes in and just at City, you can't really judge what he's done with Elijah Morrison, because he might not be ready, and it might just be that sort of situation. Obviously, he's not City's player, but he brought George Earthy to Ashton Gate on loan last season, and when he first came in, he didn't quite look up to championship level, and he was willing to kind of put him to one side. He worked with him on the training ground, didn't use him loads in the first half of the season, and then I think most City fans would agree he was probably one of the best players second half of the season. So although it's not a City player, there's obviously skills there that he can work and develop players, and I don't really see any reason why that wouldn't be the same with youth players, even if he maybe just needs to have a bit more trust to throw him in when things are getting tough.
Yeah, interesting stuff, and it will be interesting to see how he gets on at Norwich if and when that deal does get completed. I think it's probably fair from my end to say that I'm expecting that one to get done. That's probably fair to say for you as well, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, I think everything we've heard is that it's probably a case of when, not if. I think most circles down here seem to be quite keen for that to happen sooner rather than later. So we can almost move on to talking about a replacement rather than when this happens.
Yeah, I think that's the that's probably the thing to bear in mind, is that both sides want this to happen as quickly as possible. And obviously the two best places I'll say to keep up with that is Pinken.com and Bristol Live, where you can obviously read more of Dan's articles. You can also follow him on X and things like that. And of course, go to Pinken.com/subscribe and you'll have access to all of our content around Manning and all the things that are going to come over a busy summer. Thanks very much for joining me, Dan. Really appreciate it. And obviously, join us again soon for, I'm sure, some more Liam Manning content.